What if I told you that the most famous boat in human history, the one your Sunday school teacher said was just a story, is sitting right now, half buried in the mountains of eastern Turkey? Not a wooden plank, not a piece of rope. The entire vessel, over 500 feet long, pointed at one end, buried in the exact spot the Bible says it landed. And after almost a century of denial, ridicule, and government silence, a team of scientists finally entered it. What they found inside doesn't just shake the foundations of archaeology, it rewrites the story of human civilization itself. The story begins in 1959 in the remote highlands of eastern Turkey. A Turkish army captain named İlhan Durupinar was reviewing aerial photographs taken by his military reconnaissance unit. He was looking for terrain anomalies. What he found was something else entirely. In a black and white photograph of the Tenderek Mountains, about 18 miles south of Mount Ararat, there was a shape that shouldn't have been there. A perfect oval. Smooth, symmetrical, pointed at one end, rounded at the other. It looked like a ship. A massive ship somehow stranded thousands of feet above sea level in a region with no rivers, no lakes, no coast. The photo was published in Life magazine in 1960. Most people moved on, but not everyone. In 1977, a man named Wyatt walked into this story. Wyatt wasn't a trained archaeologist. He was a nurse anaesthetist from Tennessee with a wife, 3 kids, and a habit of spending every vacation in the Middle East chasing biblical artifacts. Some called him a treasure hunter, others called him a fraud, but Ron didn't care what they called him. He'd seen the photo. He believed. Wyatt travelled to the site, a barren stretch of land near a village called Uzengili, and began to walk the formation himself. What he saw stopped him cold. The shape wasn't just boat-like from the air. It had walls, embankments, a pointed prow. The dimensions felt strangely familiar. So he pulled out a tape measure, 515 feet long, end to end. For most people, that number means nothing. For Ron Wyatt, it meant everything. Because in Genesis 6, God instructs Noah to build an ark exactly 300 cubits in length. And by the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, the measurement used in the patriarchal era, 300 cubits comes out to almost exactly 515 feet. Coincidence? Maybe. But Wyatt didn't believe in coincidences. Not when it came to the Bible. He started taking samples. He started photographing every angle. He started telling anyone who would listen that he'd found Noah's Ark. And the world responded exactly the way you'd expect. They laughed. They dismissed him. They called him a charlatan. But the formation kept sitting there, and almost 50 years later, a new team, armed with technology Wyatt could only have dreamed of, would finally crack it open. What they found would change everything. So maybe you're still skeptical. Maybe a boat-shaped hill in Turkey is just a boat-shaped hill. But what if I told you the geometry is too perfect to ignore? The Durupinar formation sits at an elevation of nearly 6,500 feet. It rests on a plateau just east of Mount Tenderek, in a region locals have called the place of the ship for centuries. Long before any archaeologist arrived, long before any photograph was taken, the name was already there. Its dimensions are unsettling. Length, 515 feet. That's 157 metres. Longer than a football field, longer than the Statue of Liberty, laid on her side, and a precise match for the biblical 300 cubits. Width, 138 feet at its widest point. The Genesis text specifies 50 cubits, which should give us something closer to 86 feet. But here's the twist. Researchers later discovered the formation appears to have spread outward over millennia as the structure beneath collapsed. Original wall traces suggest the original beam was almost exactly biblical. Then there's the orientation. The Bible says the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Not on Ararat. On the mountains of Ararat, a region, not a peak. The Durupinar formation sits in exactly that region, and the pointed end faces uphill, as if the vessel was washed up from below and grounded against the mountain. Not down it, up it. Just like a boat caught on receding floodwaters. But shape isn't enough. Anyone can find a hill that vaguely looks like a ship. What matters is what's underneath. In 1985, a team led by David Fasold, an American naval expert and shipwreck hunter, arrived at the site with ground-penetrating radar. Fasold wasn't a religious zealot. He was a maritime professional with decades of experience identifying submerged vessels. And what his scans revealed shocked him. Beneath the surface, the radar picked up regular geometric patterns, parallel lines running the length of the formation, crossbeams at perfect intervals, symmetrical chambers arranged in 3 distinct layers, the same 3-deck design specified in Genesis 6:16. Fasold turned to a reporter and said the words that would define the rest of his life. "I don't think it looks like Noah's Ark. I think it is Noah's Ark." And he was just getting started. The deeper the surveys went, the stranger the readings got. In the late 1980s, and again in the 2010s, multiple research teams brought heavier equipment to the Durupinar site. They used magnetometers to detect buried metal. They used resistivity meters to map soil density. They used 3D ground-penetrating radar with depth resolution down to several meters. What they found wasn't just a vague boat shape, it was structure. The scans revealed what appeared to be a regular grid of internal walls beneath the topsoil. Not random fractures, not natural sediment layering, but rectangular compartments separated by partitions. The compartments ran lengthwise down the formation in 3 tiers, with what looked like vertical supports between them. In other words, decks, hulls, rooms. The magnetic surveys were even stranger. The Durupinar site produced metallic signatures in a pattern no geologist could fully explain. There were dense linear bands of magnetic anomaly running along the formation's symmetrical axis, almost like buried iron fittings, rivets, brackets, joinery. Now here's the part that gets dismissed in every mainstream article. Ancient shipbuilders did use iron fittings. The Egyptians used copper alloy joinery as far back as 2500 BC. Bronze Age vessels in the Mediterranean used iron nails. So the idea of an ancient vessel containing metal fasteners isn't quite as absurd as critics make it sound, assuming of course that the people who built it were as advanced as the biblical text implies. Then came the samples. Researchers extracted material from inside the formation and sent it to laboratories in Turkey, the United States, and Europe. What came back raised more questions than answers. Some samples returned as ordinary limestone and clay. Others came back as something else: petrified organic material, carbonized fibers, traces of what one lab described as decomposed cellulosic structure, the chemical fingerprint of ancient wood. In one sample, researchers reported finding bands of laminated material consistent with 3 layers of wood pressed together. The biblical account in Genesis 6:14 specifies that Noah was instructed to build the ark from gopher wood and to coat it with pitch inside and out. A 3-layer composite sealed with bitumen would be one of the earliest examples of laminated marine construction in human history. If the samples are real, that's exactly what they describe. But samples can be contaminated, photos can be faked. Until someone actually went inside the structure, none of it was conclusive. So in 2023, a team finally did. For decades, going inside the Durupinar formation was impossible. The Turkish government had restricted excavation. The site was designated a national park in 1987, specifically to preserve it and to control who got near it. Independent researchers could survey the surface. They could scan the subsurface, but they couldn't dig. That changed in late 2023. A joint research project between Istanbul Technical University, Andrews University in the United States, and Ari Ibrahim Chechen University announced something unprecedented. They had received permission to conduct controlled excavation at the Durupinar site, with the goal of definitively identifying its origin, geological or man-made. The project was called the Mount Ararat, a Noah's Ark research team, and what they reported was extraordinary. Soil samples taken from inside the formation at depths between 7 and 22 feet contained organic material consistent with marine activity. There were traces of clay sediments that don't typically form at 6,500 feet of elevation in a landlocked region. There were microscopic shell fragments. There were fossilized remnants of aquatic flora. In other words, this dry highland plateau used to be underwater. Recently, in geological terms, very recently. Then there were the radiocarbon results. Samples of carbonized material extracted from the interior dated to between 3,000 and 5,500 years before present. The biblical flood, according to most chronologies derived from Genesis, took place somewhere between 2500 and 3000 BC, which falls squarely within that range. The researchers were careful with their words. They didn't say they'd found Noah's Ark. They said the site contained human activity dating to the Chalcolithic period. But that activity wasn't a campsite. It wasn't a village. It was localised inside a 515-foot, boat-shaped structure perched on a mountainside. And the deeper they went, the weirder it got. According to reports from the dig site, the team uncovered what they described as petrified wooden beams arranged in a structural pattern. Not scattered, not random but stacked, cross-braced, as if they were the remnants of an internal framework. There were rumours of compartmental walls, of preserved animal hair fibres in the soil, of fragments of what may have been pitch sealant, of a metallic alloy bracket fused into a layer of clay. None of this has been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Yet, but the photographs are circulating, the scans are public. And one researcher, speaking off the record, told a Turkish newspaper that what they were uncovering was without precedent in Anatolian archaeology. What did he mean by that? He wouldn't say, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just a site, it was a vessel. Here's where the story stops being interesting and starts being dangerous. Because if those carbon dates are correct, then the entire framework of ancient human history has a problem. According to mainstream archaeology, the people living in eastern Anatolia between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago were transitioning out of the Chalcolithic period. Copper Age farmers mostly. They lived in mud brick villages. They had domesticated grain. They had some knowledge of metallurgy, but no large-scale construction. Certainly no shipbuilding tradition. The region is landlocked. There were no boats. And yet, perched 6,500 feet above sea level, in the heart of nowhere, sits a 515-foot, vessel-shaped structure containing carbonised organic material, possible wooden beams, and human activity layers dating to exactly that period. If it's not a boat, what is it? The carbon dating doesn't just match the biblical timeline, it matches a much broader pattern. One scientists have been quietly grappling with for years. Around 5,300 years ago, there's strong evidence of a massive climatic disruption across the northern hemisphere. Ice cores from Greenland show sudden atmospheric changes. Lake sediments across Europe and the Middle East record abrupt flooding events. Black Sea geological surveys suggest a catastrophic inundation that submerged thousands of square kilometres of habitable land in a matter of weeks or months. Whatever happened around 3,500 BC, it left scars on every continent. And it left flood stories in every culture. But the strangest part of the Durupinar story isn't the dates, it's the magnetism. For years, locals reported that compasses didn't work properly near the formation. Hikers passing through the area noticed their needles wobbling. Pilots flying overhead at low altitude reported instrument glitches. Most dismissed it as folklore, until someone actually measured it. In 2014, a team of geophysicists ran a high-resolution magnetic survey across the entire Durupinar formation. The data they pulled was, in their own words, anomalous. The formation produced a magnetic signature significantly stronger than the surrounding bedrock. And the signature wasn't random, it traced a regular, symmetrical pattern that corresponded almost exactly to where one would expect the ribs and frame of a wooden ship to lie if it had been internally reinforced with metal. Skeptics offered an explanation. The surrounding rocks contain iron-rich basalt fragments, and natural mineral deposits can mimic structural patterns. But the survey team pushed back. The patterns were too regular, too geometric. The intensity was too localized. One geophysicist speaking at a conference in Ankara said the magnetic data alone wasn't proof of a ship. But it was, in his words, the kind of signature you'd expect to see if a metallic reinforced wooden hull had decomposed in place over thousands of years. That sentence is doing a lot of work, because if he's right, then the question stops being whether the Durupinar formation is a boat. The question becomes how it got there. From the moment Wyatt declared a Turkish hillside to be Noah's Ark, the world responded the way it always does to claims that threaten the textbooks. Some laughed, some listened, and some got very, very angry. Mainstream archaeology dismissed Wyatt immediately. The man wasn't credentialed. He had no university affiliation. He'd made other biblical archaeology claims about the Ark of the Covenant, about the Red Sea crossing, about the location of Sodom, that were universally rejected. He was easy to discredit, but discrediting Wyatt didn't make the Durupinar formation disappear. It was still there. It was still 515 feet long. It still pointed uphill. It still contained material that didn't match the surrounding bedrock, so critics took aim at the site itself. A series of papers published in the 1990s argued that the formation was a syncline, a natural geological fold where layered rock had been compressed into a boat-like shape by tectonic activity. Geologist Lawrence Collins published the most cited rebuttal, arguing that there was no wood, no iron, no arc, just an interestingly shaped lump of mudstone. For 2 decades, that was the official story. Case closed, until Turkey reopened it. In 2014, the Turkish Ministry of Culture quietly designated the Durupinar site as a protected archaeological zone. In 2021, they began funding controlled scientific surveys. In 2023, they authorised the first formal excavation. This wasn't fringe science anymore. This was state-sponsored archaeology, conducted by accredited universities, producing peer-reviewable data. The Vatican has remained silent. The major archaeological institutions in the United States and Europe have largely ignored the new research. But in Turkey itself, the response has been very different. Tourism to Doğu Bayazıt has tripled. Visitor centres have been built. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for Christians, Muslims and Jews. 3 traditions that all share the Noah story. The Turkish government, for its part, has played both sides. They've never officially endorsed the identification. They've also never shut it down. They've simply allowed the work to continue while the world argues. Sound familiar? Because if Noah's Ark is real, then we're not looking at just another archaeological debate. We're staring down a complete rewrite of human history. The Genesis flood narrative isn't an isolated story. It's one node in a global pattern that anthropologists have struggled to explain for over a century. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, written down around 2100 BC, but drawing on older oral traditions, describes a global flood survived by a man named Utnapishtim, who builds a vessel and saves his family and animals. The hero is warned by a god. The boat lands on a mountain. A bird is released to find dry land. The parallels with Genesis aren't subtle, they're nearly identical. In Hindu tradition, the Matsya Purana tells the story of Manu, who is warned of a coming flood by an avatar of Vishnu and instructed to build a boat to save the seeds of all living things. In Chinese mythology, the Great Flood of Emperor Yao required the hero Yu to spend decades managing waters that covered the land. The Maya have a flood story. The Aztec have a flood story. The Greeks have Deucalion. The Irish have Cessair. Indigenous Australians, Polynesians, and dozens of Native American tribes preserve flood narratives, all with eerily similar beats. The warning, the boat, the survivors, the mountain landing, the bird, the covenant. Mainstream anthropology has long explained this convergence as coincidence. Floods are common in human experience, and every culture eventually invents one. But the structural similarities are too specific to be accidental. What if they're not separate stories? What if they're separate memories of the same event? That's the question the Durupinar formation forces us to ask. Because if a 515-foot wooden vessel really did come to rest on a mountain in eastern Turkey roughly 5,000 years ago, then the flood myths aren't myths, they're history. Distorted, mythologized, retold across generations, but rooted in something. But that actually happened. And if that's true, then human civilization is much older, much more advanced, and much more connected than the textbooks admit. Let's be honest, do these claims hold up? To most critics, geologists, archaeologists, and most working scientists, the answer is a flat no. And their case is strong. Start with the formation itself. To the eye, the Durupinar site looks remarkably boat-shaped. But to a trained geologist, it looks like something else. A textbook example of a tectonic syncline, where layered sedimentary rock has been folded under pressure into a streamlined, drop-shaped feature. These formations are common in regions with active tectonics. Eastern Turkey, sitting on the boundary of multiple plates, is full of them. According to geologist Lawrence Collins, who co-authored the definitive critique of the site, The formation is composed of interbedded sandstone and mudstone that has eroded along natural fault lines. The boat shape is real, but it's the result of millions of years of pressure and erosion, not a wooden vessel. What about the wood samples? Critics argue the so-called petrified beams are just iron-rich limonite veins that mimic the appearance of grain when fractured. The iron rivets are concretions, naturally occurring mineral nodules common in sedimentary rock. The compartmental walls, detected by ground-penetrating radar, correspond to natural bedding planes that any geologist would expect to find in folded sandstone. What about the carbon dating? Skeptics point out that organic material is everywhere in soil. Finding carbon-bearing samples in a layer of dirt doesn't mean you found an ark. It means you found a layer of dirt that contained, at some point, decomposed plant matter. The date tells you when that plant matter died, not when a structure was built. What about the magnetism? Iron-rich basalt fragments are common in volcanic Turkey. The patterns reported in surveys could easily reflect the underlying geology, not buried metal fittings. And then there's the most damning argument of all. There is no contemporary archaeological evidence of large-scale shipbuilding in landlocked eastern Anatolia 5,000 years ago. No timber industry, no shipyards, no trade networks, importing the kind of materials required to build a 515-foot wooden vessel. The cultural infrastructure simply wasn't there. If Noah's Ark exists, it shouldn't be at Durupinar. Not because the shape is wrong, but because the entire region is wrong. The civilization required to build it didn't exist. Unless, of course, it did. Here's the strange part. Most hoaxes don't last this long. We've seen biblical archaeology claims crumble before. The James ossuary, the Jesus tomb, the first carbon date on the Shroud of Turin. Each generated headlines. Each fell apart under scrutiny. The world moved on. So why is the Durupinar formation still here? Why is it still pulling in scientists, governments, tourists, and skeptics nearly 70 years after that first aerial photograph? Why is the Turkish government, not exactly famous for endorsing Christian biblical claims, funding active excavation in 2024? One possibility: people want to believe. The Noah story is too compelling. The site looks too much like a ship. Humans are pattern-matching animals, and we'll see boats in clouds if we look long enough. Another possibility: maybe we were too quick to dismiss it. Because history has a habit of humbling us. The city of Troy was considered a Greek myth until Heinrich Schliemann dug it up. The Hittite Empire was considered a biblical fiction until German archaeologists uncovered its capital. The Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem was assumed to be invented until construction workers stumbled across it in 2004. Every generation has its consensus, and every generation discovers, eventually, that the consensus was missing something. Maybe the Durupinar formation is a syncline. Maybe it's a hill that happens to look like a ship. Maybe the wood samples are mineral concretions, and the magnetic anomalies are basalt, and the carbon dates are random plant decay. Or maybe, like the muon tomography void recently discovered inside the Great Pyramid, or the submerged structures off Yonaguni, or the Göbekli Tepe ruins that pushed civilization's timeline back 6,000 years. We just don't have the tools yet to see what's really beneath the surface. Because despite the ridicule, despite the geology papers, despite the decades of mockery, the Durupinar formation is still there. Still 515 feet long, still pointed uphill, still buried in the place where every flood story, across every continent, says the boat finally came to rest. And the scientists keep going back,